Hello and welcome to Unacademy IAS English, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. The United States has hit several companies around the world with economic sanctions. Companies from India, China, Turkey, and several other countries, including few other entities and few individuals, have been listed by the US for economic sanctions. So this is the topic for discussion in this special video. The development is that the United States has levied sanctions on nearly 400 organizations, entities, and individuals. 19 Indian companies are part of the list, along with 2 individuals from India. The US has alleged that these companies which have been sanctioned, they were supplying dual-use technology to Russia. When we say dual-use technology, we are referring to civilian technology which has military applications. So according to the US, these companies were involved in supplying civilian technology to Russian military and defense industries, which has enabled Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. So this major development has implications for India. This does impact India-US relations. It does have implications for India's ties with Russia and India's stand on the Russia-Ukraine war. So we need to analyze the importance of this development, understand what are these sanctions, how come only US and few Western countries levy such sanctions against few select countries. Is there a hypocrisy involved on part of the Western countries where they use economic sanctions and their control over the global economy to target few countries specifically? Is there a geopolitical motive? And how should India deal with these developments? And more importantly, is the US really targeting India? Because that has been the predominant media narrative, that of late US has been targeting India, not just over the Russia war, but even with regard to the revival of the Khalistan movement. So let's examine all these points in detail. But before that, if you are liking our initiatives, do support us with your likes and comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And also, before I start, we have an important announcement. Starting from November, we will bring to you UCAN, Unacademy's Current Affairs Navigator, as a one-stop destination for all your current affairs problems. So every week, we will conduct 4 live sessions right here on our YouTube channel, and these sessions would be current affairs based sessions. It would be subject based discussion of all the important current affairs. So in a month, we will provide 15 free lectures covering all the important subjects and covering current affairs from multiple sources. These sessions will be live from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. And you can see the schedule of the first week over here. We'll be starting with current affairs from international relations and as well as internal security and disaster management on the 4th of November, followed by environment, ecology, social issues, and polity. So like this, every week, we will bring to you these current affairs classes under the UCAN program. So do ensure you attend these sessions live and do support us with your likes and comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So let's get started with the discussion. First, let's look at the development which has happened over the last few days. A few days ago, the US sanctioned several organizations, entities, and individuals from multiple countries. The Department of State, Department of Treasury, and the Department of Commerce. They've all individually come out with a list targeting certain companies in India and other countries, and they've been allegedly supplying dual-use technology to Russian industries, which are producing weapons for Russian armed forces. So let's get some insight into these US accusations and why these sanctions have been imposed. According to the Department of State, the Department of Commerce, and Department of Treasury, they have created a list of companies and individuals who have been enabling Russia's war efforts. As you know, Western countries led by US have targeted Russia with economic sanctions ever since Russia invaded Ukraine. In fact, even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine from several years, Russia has been hit with Western sanctions. So as part of the sanctions regime, a few Indian companies are getting caught up in this web of economic sanctions and geopolitics. This is not the first time that American sanctions have hit Indian companies. In fact, last year in November, an Indian company was accused of supplying electronic components and integrated circuits which enabled Russian military to develop advanced weapons. So right now, several companies from India involved in the aviation sector, aerospace industry, defense industry, and electronics industry, they have been targeted with American sanctions. For example, we have few Indian companies working in the aviation and aerospace sector which allegedly have supplied goods or services which has enabled Russian defense forces. Essentially, these components from India would have enabled Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. There's also an allegation against few companies that they are procuring components from Europe and US and then resupplying it to the Russian market, which is enabling Russia's defense industry and thus enabling its war in Ukraine. For example, a company called Ascent Aviation, based out of Delhi, has supplied few spare parts and given ground support to aircraft and helicopters used by Russian armed forces. The directors of these companies, Vivek Kumar Mishra and Sudhir Kumar, who are Indian citizens, have also been brought under the sanctions regime by the US authorities. So it essentially means that the bank accounts of these companies present abroad might be frozen. These companies may not be able to trade with European and American markets. And these individuals might even face other kind of travel restrictions and economic restrictions. So this could essentially cripple the functioning of the company itself, and it could have serious impact on the Indian industry. So let's check what would be the impact as well on Indian industry because of these sanctions. But before that, let's see which are the other companies targeted. There is a Bengaluru-based company which has also been hit with the sanctions for allegedly supplying electronic equipment which has enabled Russia to build radars and other electronic weaponry. There are few companies which are accused of working with Russian defense agents who are looking to procure key technologies and components to aid Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. So in total, 19 Indian companies along with 2 individuals from India have been brought under the sanctions regime. Now, the US and European Union, along with allies like Japan, they maintain a list called Common High Priority List, the CHPL. Similar entity lists are maintained by the Department of Commerce of US and the Department of Treasury as well. So these US departments, they track companies and entities around the world which might be supplying dual-use technology to countries which are under sanctions like Russia. So according to US, these companies have violated this list maintained by the Bureau of Industry and Security under the US Department of Commerce. They maintain a list of certain equipment and goods and technologies. So if any company is supplying those technologies and components to Russia or any country which is under American Western sanctions, they will be brought under the sanctions regime. They will be sanctioned through the US-led financial system, which could have a possible economic impact on the operations of the company. So if you look at US sanctions on Russia, Western sanctions on Russia, this has been going on from quite a number of years. In fact, even before the Ukraine war began, since 2014 itself, the Western countries have targeted Russia with economic sanctions. When Russia invaded Crimean Peninsula and annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, and when Russia started backing pro-separatist groups, pro-Russian separatist organizations in eastern Ukraine, leading to destabilization of Ukraine, since then the West has boycotted Russia. In fact, they even removed Russia from the G8, turning it into the G7, and the Western countries led by US have targeted key sectors in Russia, especially the oil industry, the defense industry. They've even targeted Russian oligarchs who are very close to the Kremlin, frozen the bank accounts and assets of several Russian companies and industries, and even Russian billionaires have been targeted with these sanctions. The idea is essentially to cripple the Russian economy and deliver an economic blow in order to curb the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So obviously, one needs to evaluate how fair is this policy. Are Western countries being hypocritical in targeting few countries purely on geopolitical grounds? or are they using sanctions to bring stability in the world? Now, if you look at the set of sanctions that Western countries have imposed over the years, that is over the last decade, these sanctions have targeted several key sectors of Russia. Russian media outlets have been targeted, Russian defense companies, oil companies have been targeted, and as well as some important officials who are close to Putin, including Putin himself. The assets belonging to them, the accounts and financial assets belonging to them which are located abroad, they have been targeted under the sanctions regime. So this has been a continuing pattern where Western countries have hit the Russian leadership, Russian industries, and the Russian economy. So let's see what kind of sanctions have been imposed. Russia's oil industry, which is a major revenue generator for the Kremlin, has been targeted in order to cripple Russian oil and gas imports. That is, the imports by other countries, for example, European countries, were heavily dependent on imports of Russian oil and gas. So after Russia invaded Ukraine, the oil and gas industry has been almost crippled, which has almost stopped Russia's export of oil and gas to European market. Similarly, the defense industry, the entire military industrial complex, has been targeted as well, which has made it difficult for Russian engineering companies, defense and industrial organizations to import essential components, spare parts and technologies from other countries, from other companies around the world. They have even targeted Russian banks and Russian companies having foreign bank accounts by removing them from the SWIFT payment system, which disables these organizations of Russia to carry out cross-border payments. The SWIFT is a cross-border payment system dominated by Western banks and financial institutions. Even Russian media outlets, which have been promoting the Russian narrative in the war since 2014, and Russian social media channels on popular platforms like YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, etc., have been targeted. And in fact, Western companies have been used for this purpose. The tech giants, the social media platforms have been used by the US government, and they've been forced to remove any content which is pro-Russia. These media channels have been blocked out, and essentially they have tried to target the Russian narrative and the Russian propaganda in the war. So this also leads to questions whether the Western countries are just promoting their own narrative, because they do have a vested self-interest to promote the Western narrative in the war, to target Russia and to villainize Russia. If you examine the root cause of the Ukraine conflict, clearly Russia was not the only country to be blamed. The NATO, which was expanding eastwards, the European Union, which was expanding eastwards, created a trigger and provocated Russia, especially with the aggressive pursuit by US to bring Ukraine under NATO and other Eastern European countries under NATO and European Union. The possibility of NATO forces and weapons being stationed near Russian border is what provocated Russia in the first place. But of course, the American narrative is that it is Russia which is the aggressor. It is Russia which has been pursuing an aggressive policy against Ukraine and threatening stability across Europe. So whatever is the actual truth, the fact is that few countries are able to weaponize their control over the global economy to target select countries. And definitely this doesn't appear to be a fair system. But that is how geopolitics works. The countries which are dominant and powerful can define geopolitics and control the economy to punish other countries whom they consider to be their rivals. So Russian officials, individuals, oligarchs also have been targeted. Their financial assets abroad, their bank accounts abroad have been frozen. And again, this is possible due to the control that Western countries have on the global banking and financial system. Now, after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, since then the sanctions have been stepped up. Thousands of sanctions have been imposed targeting different organizations and entities and sectors, including Russian officials who have been accused of committing war crimes. So this is the current situation. Now, this leads us to a big question. Should countries like India follow the sanctions imposed by a few countries which appear to target a select group of countries? So let's understand this further, because the US and the West have not only targeted Russia with such sanctions, but many other countries whom they consider as their rivals. For example, China has also been hit with American sanctions for alleged human rights violations in Xinjiang, in Tibet, etc. Iran has been targeted with Western sanctions, particularly US sanctions, from a long time over its nuclear weapons program. In fact, these American sanctions on Iran affected India-Iran relations as well. Almost 12-13 years ago, around 2009 or 2010, India had to bypass the sanctions on Iran to protect its strategic ties with Iran. The then Manmohan Singh government bypassed the American sanctions and continued the strategic ties with Iran because we had key investments in Iran, such as the Chabahar port project. Iran was a major oil supplier to India. We had important energy projects which had been proposed. So to protect that strategic relationship, India bypassed the American sanctions because India's policy is that we don't follow unilateral sanctions. Given that India follows an autonomous, independent foreign policy, we don't generally follow unilateral sanctions imposed by one country against another or by a group of countries against a select list of countries. India always follows sanctions imposed by the UN, by multilateral systems such as FATF, but we don't generally abide by unilateral sanctions. Take, for example, Western sanctions on Myanmar. Given that the military regime in Myanmar had violated human rights and democratic rights, Myanmar had been targeted with Western sanctions since 1980s, 1990s. And even recently, post-2021, Western sanctions have been brought back against Myanmar. But India generally bypasses these unilateral sanctions and we continue to maintain our independent foreign policy. But in the case of Iran, there was an exception. Recently, when Donald Trump in 2018 quit the nuclear deal with Iran and brought back the crippling sanctions on Iran, India was forced by the Trump administration to cut off oil trade and to cut off economic relations with Iran. This is a rare instance where India was forced by US to follow its sanctions. So to protect our ties with the US and also to protect the Indian companies, India had to stop the oil imports, zero out oil imports from Iran, which affected our strategic relations. And since then, Iran has been upset with India. Even countries like North Korea have been hit with American Western sanctions. In fact, few years ago, the US Congress adopted a law called CAATSA in 2017. It stands for Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. This American law, it labels three countries, that is Russia, Iran, and North Korea, as the adversaries of United States and hits them with economic sanctions. It places primary sanctions on Russian, Iranian, and North Korean companies, entities, and organizations. Any third party which would trade with these countries, especially in critical sectors like oil, defense, etc., they would be hit with secondary sanctions as well. If any other company or foreign organization were to trade with these organizations or entities in Russia, Iran, and North Korea, as per CAATSA, the third parties would also be hit with secondary sanctions. And quite often, India has faced the threat of secondary sanctions under CAATSA. For example, when we procured the S-400 air defense system from Russia, there was a possibility that US could target India with secondary sanctions. But however, given the close India-US relations, the US did grant an exemption. India also got an exemption over the strategic Chabahar port project with Iran. Since the Chabahar port project was vital for India's connectivity plans with Afghanistan and Central Asia, the US did grant an exemption to certain projects such as the Chabahar port project. But otherwise, of late, especially post-2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, India has also been under severe pressure from US and Western countries to follow their sanctions. And this is indeed affecting Indian interests. Now, one common question I get from students whenever we discuss the topic of sanctions is, what are sanctions? What kind of sanctions are imposed? How does it affect the targeted country? And another question I get is, how come only few countries like US and European countries can impose sanctions? Why not others? So let me clarify these two doubts. When we say sanctions, it refers to a broad set of economic and diplomatic sanctions. It's essentially a type of coercive diplomacy, forceful diplomacy, to use one's dominant position and control over the global markets and the global geopolitics to punish and target a certain country. In fact, this is a most suggested tool under coercive diplomacy. Several thinkers, experts, philosophers also talk about the usefulness of sanctions in diplomacy. From the likes of Kautilya to Machiavelli, they talk about coercive diplomacy using one's economic strength and geopolitical influence to dominate over rivals and to target the rivals by using coercive methods. So when we say sanctions, it refers to a set of embargoes and bans and restrictions, particularly targeting the economy of the targeted country. So it could include bans on trading with the country. The companies of, let's say, Western powers could be entirely prohibited from trading with the companies in the targeted country across all sectors, across all commodities. This could also mean a specific ban on certain goods and items, especially dual-use items, civilian technologies which possibly have a military application, which could be used in weapons, etc. So those specific products could be targeted and prohibited with regard to trade with the targeted country. Investments can be restricted. Investments in the capital market could be specifically restricted. Import controls can be placed where other countries and companies from around the world are prohibited from trading with certain countries and their companies. And even the financial assets of the targeted country could be frozen. It could be the government financial assets and bank accounts present abroad, or the assets belonging to private companies, individuals. For example, how Russian billionaires and oligarchs have been targeted, how Russian companies have been targeted, how Russian media outlets are facing a ban on social media, which is primarily owned by American companies. So this is called asset freeze, where the financial assets or any assets related to the targeted country could be completely frozen, and even officials and individuals could be targeted. Their personal wealth could be frozen, which is present abroad, right? Their assets present abroad could be frozen. So these sanctions will only work when the country imposing them is a powerful country which can dominate the global economy. Not every country can impose sanctions. A middle power or a small weak country can never impose sanctions. That will have no meaning. It will have no impact. For sanctions to be impactful, it has to come from the powerful countries, the most powerful economies such as United States, which can control and manipulate the global economy. And definitely the US and the West, they are in a position to control the global banking and financial system. Because the US dollar is indeed the global reserve currency, the most preferred reserve currency. Even the euro, for that matter, is a preferred reserve currency. US and European countries, they dominate the banking financial system through their control of World Bank and IMF, the Bretton Woods institutions. Most of the world and global trade depends on the dollar-based system, dollar-based transactions, which are enabled through the SWIFT payment gateway, which facilitates cross-border payments. So this entire banking financial setup is largely controlled by the Western companies, which eventually come under the Western government's influence. So countries like US and European countries, which have that kind of control, they can manipulate the economy, the banking and financial system, and they can punish certain countries which are dependent on the US dollar and the dollar-based banking and financial system. So this is why American sanctions and European sanctions are more effective compared to the sanctions of any other country. In fact, if a country doesn't have this kind of control, the sanctions will have no meaning or no impact. Now, the big question is, are really the US sanctions working against Russia or other rivals like Iran, North Korea, etc.? Data shows that definitely Western sanctions have dented the Russian GDP. Most experts agree that Russian GDP has definitely been impacted, especially over the last 2 years. The sanctions from 2014 to 2022, they had a minimal impact because the sanctions were relatively weaker. But after Russia invaded Ukraine, this was a major escalation by Russia, where Russia broke international law, violated the principles of UN Charter, and invaded Ukraine and violated its sovereignty. So given this grave aggression by Russia, Western countries stepped up the sanctions from 2022, imposing a wide set of sanctions which hit Russia's oil industry, especially its oil and gas exports and other key industries as well. So there has been a certain impact on Russian GDP and the Russian economy without a doubt. The financial assets of Russian oligarchs, Russian officials, and many major Russian companies have been frozen, which has affected their operations and the economic capabilities as well. But however, Russia has been able to largely bypass the full-fledged impact of the sanctions, because such sanctions can never be 100% effective, especially against a major power like Russia. Maybe if it was a small country, a small country, it would have been isolated and crippled. But major countries like Russia can bypass the sanctions. Of course, there will be some impact which will dent the economy, but there are ways of bypassing the sanctions, and Russia has been able to do that. Russia has been working with its close friends like China, India, Turkey, and many others, including Iran, North Korea, and others, to bypass the Western sanctions. Of course, China, Iran, North Korea, they're all part of the same axis as that of Russia. Given their anti-West inclination, they would not naturally bypass those sanctions and assist Russia to overcome the impact of the sanctions. But the case of India is unique. Since we follow an independent foreign policy, we are not bound by the foreign policy interests of other countries. We are not allies of US or the West. At the same time, we are neither allies of Russia. We look after our own interests, our self-interests. And accordingly, India has, in a way, stood with Russia during the war. Given how Soviet Union has always backed India since 1960s, how Russia has always supported India at the global platforms on important issues, including the boundary issues with Pakistan and China, and how Russia has backed our military modernization, it was only a matter of reciprocity to be grateful towards Russia and Soviet Union. It was more of an emotional, ideological connection as well, and a more pragmatic decision to continue the strategic ties, the close relations with Russia. So India bypassed the sanctions. We never criticized Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, India became the largest buyer, one of the largest buyers of Russian oil and gas. That's why India stands accused by Western governments of being a laundromat country. European countries and US have accused India of laundering Russian oil. Russia not only became the largest supplier of energy to India, but India would process the crude oil and gas into various petrochemical products, and we would re-export this back into the European market, thereby bypassing their sanctions. So this approach of several friends of Russia, right, who have supported Russia, who have bypassed the Western sanctions, they have helped Russia to bypass the full-fledged impact. And so no wonder Russia is pushing to de-dollarize the economy, to end the Western dominance on the global economy. For example, at platforms like BRICS, at the recent Kazan summit in Russia, the BRICS members spoke about de-dollarization to end the dollar dominance and the Western dominance on the global economy. They are looking to trade using alternate currencies. That's exactly what India did with Russia and as well as with Iran. The then Manmohan Singh government, when we bypassed the sanctions on Iran, we used alternate currencies, including the Indian rupee, to pay for Iranian oil. And we have used a similar arrangement with Russia. We used alternate currencies like UAE's dirhams, the Chinese currency as well, to make payments for Russian oil. Then we created Vostro accounts and started using a rupee-ruble payment arrangement. Even though it has difficulties, we have tried these alternate payment methods and we have tried to reduce the dependency on the dollar-based system. So BRICS countries are actively exploring settlement of trade using alternate currencies, their own national currencies. They're working on the concept of a BRICS currency as well, to end the domination of the US dollar, and Russia is leading those efforts with China and other countries. And India also has supported these efforts to de-dollarize the global economy. So these sanctions are not 100% effective. Of course, it will dent the economy, but powerful countries like Russia can bypass the sanctions if they get the support of some other countries, so that they can move away from the dollar-based system, the Western-controlled banking financial system, and create alternate payment systems. This also exposes the American hypocrisy. That is what some experts and analysts believe. While US targets few countries like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, the US is almost silent. It is even enabling other aggressors like Israel, which has been accused of committing a genocide in Gaza against Palestinians. The US has not only stood with Israel, given complete diplomatic support to its war in Gaza and the current war in Lebanon, it has even supplied arms and weapons, provided high-end technology to Israel, which has enabled Israel to target the militant groups and escalate the conflict in West Asia. So several commentators and several countries have called out the hypocrisy of US, that US uses sanctions purely for its own geopolitical interests to target only the rivals, the geopolitical rivals, while forgiving its own allies who might be committing similar or even graver violations of international law. So do let me know, where do you stand on this debate? Is the US being hypocritical through its sanctions regime, or is it fair? Is it fair for US to target Russia and few rival countries and excuse Israel? Or is this pure hypocrisy of US again and misuse of its dominance on the global financial and banking system? Now for India, this raises some very difficult and interesting choices. For India, it's a very confusing time, because on one hand, the US keeps saying that its partnership with India is the most defining partnership of the 21st century. This statement is largely based on India being a counterbalance to China, which US considers as the biggest threat. So as far as countering China is concerned, the US relies on India. Even for counterterrorism efforts, the US relies on India. But when it comes to India's core concerns like the revival of the Khalistan movement being seen in Western countries, or be it India's unique relationship with Russia, on these specific matters, the US takes a stand against India, almost going to the extent of targeting India. For example, the US has failed to act against pro-Khalistani elements. It has gone to the extent of accusing India of being involved in targeted assassinations, and it has worked with Canada to build a case against India to show that Indian state agencies were involved and state intelligence operatives were involved in carrying out targeted killings on Western soil. So this has created a very uncomfortable situation for India. So given the pressure India is facing on the Russia front, from several years, as I told you, India has been accused by European countries and US for enabling Russia's war, especially in the last 2 years after we bypassed the Western sanctions. But to be fair to the US, we need to look at the counter argument as well. As I told you earlier, there are instances where US has granted exemptions to India. Under the CAATSA law, be it the S-400 deal with Russia, the Chabahar port deal with Iran, these were exempted and India was not targeted with any third-party sanctions or secondary sanctions. And that's why I feel that it would be incorrect to assume that US is targeting India or singling out India. If you look at the current sanctions placed as well on hundreds of companies, only 19 companies from India have been hit. So US is not singling out India. There are companies from Turkey as well, Thailand, Malaysia, UAE as well. By the way, UAE is a close ally of the US. So it's very important for India to read the situation correctly. The US is not singling out India or targeting India specifically over here. It is part of the wider sanctions regime aimed at crippling Russia. But definitely India should be cautious, because this impacts our companies. As of now, the Indian companies which have been hit, they have said that they are not going to be impacted by the sanctions. Why? Because most of these companies don't have much business with US and European markets. The sanctions will not really affect them. They don't have much of foreign assets, foreign bank accounts. These companies largely trade with countries like Russia. So these 19 companies, most of them have stated publicly that they are not going to be impacted by the sanctions of US. But however, India needs to be cautious. See, this is not just a one-off policy of United States. Some might say that Biden is almost stepping down. He's at the vague end of his term as US presidential elections are approaching. Maybe he wants to make a big statement as he is going out. So we can't simply dismiss the policy of US as well, right? Of course, the US is aware that India would be affected, Indian companies could be impacted, and yet it went ahead with the sanctions. So that contains a message for India that the next regime, the next president, be it Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, there will be implications if US were to continue with this aggressive policy targeting Russia, which could hit other third parties like India as well. So India should be cautious, should be mindful of the American policy. We can't simply trust US as a partner, as a best friend, as a strategic partner, because there is a history of America being self-minded. In fact, there's nothing wrong with that. Most countries are self-minded. They look after their own self-interest. That's what India does as well. So we can't simply buy into the narrative, the American narrative, that US is our best friend to counter China and this is the most defining partnership. It's good to have such close ties with US. It helps India. At the same time, we should be cautious, we should be mindful, because there are pressing issues which US is not addressing. Right? The American pressure on India to target Russia, the American refusal to act against pro-Khalistani elements does create problems for India, challenges for India. At the same time, we should understand that US is not singling out India or targeting India specifically. Several companies have been targeted which were exporting components to Russian defense industry. So India should read between the lines, look at the priorities of US. At the same time, we should be mindful and careful as well. So it means that India should probably maintain a watch list. The government should know which Indian companies are trading with countries like Russia, Iran, North Korea, etc. In the current case, the government did not facilitate these companies to export the components to Russia. The companies were doing it on their own. Maybe we should maintain an import list, a sensitive list of few technologies and components, and keep a check on them so that we are aware which companies are exporting to which countries, if those countries are under sanctions. If Western countries target them, if they impose sanctions on these companies, will it affect the Indian economy? Will it affect Indian industry? So this preparedness should be there on India's part, which is currently missing. So this is my view and opinion. So do let me know what you think about this in the comment section. Do you think US is being fair in targeting Russia and eventually Indian companies as well? Or is it purely America's hypocrisy again? So what should India do? Let me know in the comments. And if you like the session, do press the like button and do subscribe to our channel. That is it. Thanks for watching.